NGO Mongolia needs you for helping to facilitate this. Badma, did you want to say anything?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for taking your time and coming to this lecture. And we're really honored to have Eric Werker as our lecturer to learn something more, because every day is a new day, and it's great to learn something from our big teachers and following their steps. And I am Batma. I'm from Mongolia NIDZU, a non-profit organization, and we're welcoming Eric Werker. Please enjoy.
Thank you. The nonprofit's doing really important work here in Mongolia, and I'm proud to be associated. Okay, so like I said, it's wonderful to be here in Mongolia. Sambino, did I get that right? Sombino or Sambino? I hadn't practiced it yet this morning. I was just impromptu. So, been thinking about the country, and really excited to have a chance to visit. As the professor mentioned in the afternoons when I'm here, I'm working on a training along with a colleague who's a lawyer for a New York-based firm who's worked with a number of countries in helping to negotiate investor agreements, who will actually be speaking at the university tomorrow afternoon. I'm not sure which faculty, but his name is Boris Dolgonis, if you have a chance to go see that if you're interested in investor agreements. And so we're working with people from across the Mongolian government who are involved in signing and in monitoring these agreements. But this talk that I want to give is about frontier economies and developing countries more broadly. I've spent most of my career thinking about how it is that developing countries can escape poverty and build the right institutions and private sector for them to have successful and long-term growth. This, of course, is, as you know, one of the biggest questions in economics since Adam Smith tackled it several hundred years ago, so I can't presume to have the answers. But I want to put forward this framework that I've developed along with colleagues Lant Pritchett, who's at Harvard Kennedy School, and Kunal Sen, who's at the Manchester University in England. There should be one more thing here. So this is my current university. I just moved from Harvard over the summer back home to Vancouver, Canada. This is the institute funded by the Canadian government, which will be hopefully running a Mongolia project soon. So we should have a chance to be working together in the future around resources and development. And also this particular project is funded through the Effective States program out of Manchester, mostly funded by the British government, where Kunal and Lant and I worked on this broad framework, and then we're applying it through about 10 countries around the world to try to gain a sense of how it fits together and how it can be used by governments and by foreign aid agencies in order to affect economic development. Now, can I just get a show of hands? How many of you are from the business faculty? Okay. Economics? Law? Public administration? Okay. What am I missing then? What's left? Just so I know who my audience is.
International relations.
International, okay, political science or international relations? Okay. Anything else? If you haven't raised your hand, you can raise it now and tell me where you're. What? Oh, you're from the private sector. Okay.
So the speaker series are very open.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, I have to know how technical to make the talk, so I apologize if some of this gets a little bit technical, but I'll try to make it approachable. Is this? No, this is something else. I should just use the keyboard?
Yeah, keyboard.
All right. So what I want to go through is 6 points here. Will you keep time for me, by the way? Tell me when to stop or ask questions. What should I aim for?
40 minutes.
40 minutes or so? Okay.
10, 15 minutes for the answers and questions.
Maybe I'll try to even go faster. Okay, so I've got a lot of slides here. I'll make sure to skip some so we get a chance to have questions and answers. So first I want to talk about the facts of economic growth, that if we want to think about how countries can grow successfully, we have to reconcile what the usual advice is against these facts. And then here's some key words, distinguishing a deals world in which investments get made not through widely applicable law, but through almost individual contracts or agreements, if there's some element of government oversight, from a rules world. And in a rules world, it would be the law that would apply to everybody equally. And then talk about the dynamics of state capability for policy implementation, or when the government says it wants to do something, does it actually do that? Is it able to do that? Or are there whether capacity or political barriers for it to follow through on those policies? And then I want to try to link the pattern of economic activity, in other words, where the firms are in the economy, the businesses, and what their interests are, with the capabilities that the government has to try to implement its policies. And then finally try to make it explain how it is that countries are able to transform, to go from poor developing countries or frontier markets to more middle income and then eventually developed countries. And I probably won't have time, but I might tell you a couple details from Liberia where I've spent several years as an advisor to the president. Not living in Liberia the entire time, but going back and forth. Okay, so here's the first fact of growth. This is the GDP per capita of Denmark over 100 years. What do you notice about it? And this is in log framework. So it basically grows at a constant rate for 100 years. And if you look at any OECD country, I mean old OECD country like the United States or Germany, it's basically going to look like this. This is the activity around World War II, so everyone's also going to experience that. The second is there are a number of countries around the world that basically have the same level of income per capita that they must have had forever, because you can't subsist on less than a certain amount of effective income per capita, because you need to have food and shelter. So if you look at countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, the Central African Republic, they're basically at the same levels of income that they must have been forever, which implies that their average growth rate is 0. So we have some countries that always grow at 2%, some countries that on average grow at 0%. And then we have a bunch of countries that grow fast sometimes, 0 other times, and then negative other times, or boom and bust growth patterns. And then finally, there's just a very, very small handful of countries that over the last 100 years or so, or 50 years, in the case of the Singapores, have been growing rapidly, and they've sustained that rapid growth. This is the exception. It's important to remember when you look at Mongolia's rapid growth since the mid-1990s. It's really hard to do that for more than 10 years. So there's really only like 13 countries that have been identified as sustaining rapid growth. Rates of growth into high economic growth here, over 6%. Pretty high growth between 4 and 6%. Moderate growth between 2 and 4%. Slow growth, 0 to 2%. Stagnation, slightly negative growth. And then collapse, negative 2%. And then if for each country we take the percentage of time that they spend in each of these categories, we get a distribution. So here's the Denmarks of the world that have steady and moderate growth. If you look at, and then it's not just Great Britain, it's also Turkey and Colombia that basically grow between 0 and 4% all the time. You see they spend 0% of the time in these other categories. The second is we have collapses, countries that have spent a lot of time in negative growth. And they spend some time in positive growth, but the real defining feature is that they've spent a lot of time in negative growth. And then we have the boom and bust countries that have spent time in pretty much every single category here. This is our Ghana, Brazil, Papua New Guinea. And then the small group of rapid growers. And here are examples, Botswana, Korea, and Taiwan, that basically spend all their time growing quickly. Unfortunately, most of the theory of economic growth has focused on average long-term growth rates. But if you look at the previous slide, that doesn't necessarily matter for countries that are going up and down and up and down. What does the average even mean for a country that's in boom and bust? The more important question should be, how can you do less negative growth episodes? And that's the way to get developed. So, if you remember one thing from this, if you want to become a rich country, just don't spend any time in this period. And as little time as possible in this period. And these things everything else is secondary. Okay. But the problem with just looking at average growth is it doesn't explain the dynamics that seem to be the most important feature. And then maybe the most exciting or cited finding in the growth literature from the past 10 or 15 years has been the importance of institutions. You may have heard of Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail. This is a book that has received wide attention. And the idea here is that the better a country's institutions are, the richer it is. And the research of Acemoglu and Simon Johnson and Jim Robinson found that if they looked 300 years ago at former colonies, and they looked at how healthy the environment was for their settlers, they found that the countries that had the most hospitable environments for the settlers ended up being the places that 300 years later had better institutions, because the settlers were more likely to establish institutions where they wanted to live, and then the places that were unhealthy for them, where they always fell sick, is where they wanted to just rule by proxy. And so they would work with the local leaders and establish extractive institutions where they could basically take all the rents out of the country. And so this was this great finding. But the problem is, so now they go around, they've convinced the world of this, but if now a country like Ecuador says, okay, what should we do with that now? The answer is, I don't know. You should have better institutions. But how do you get good institutions? And this is what this slide says. The top is how much of the empirics for current levels of income can be explained by the quality of institutions as they're measured by any number of measurements, whether looking at bureaucratic quality, corruption, law and order, whatever. And you can see here a lot can be explained. Almost 50% of income can be explained by how good the institutions are. Okay, fine. So what if we look at then how good your institutions were, let's say in 1980, and how much you grew over the next 20 or 30 years? Well, now we can only explain about 5 or 10% of that relationship. So it can explain income, but not the growth rate. Now, if we want to tell countries, like the World Bank and everybody else tells them, oh, to grow, you just have to improve your institutions. Well, then, if that were the case, we would think that the countries whose institutions got better over a 20-year period also grew over that period, right? Makes sense. But it now has basically zero explanatory power. So that means growth, even over 20 years, isn't being driven by the institutions getting better over that period. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about, deals versus rules. Very few countries could be said to follow rules capitalism, where whatever's in the books applies to everybody and everybody equally. And that sets expectations, and then contracts get resolved unbiasedly and fairly through courts. Pretty much every developing country is more in a deals world. So what happens to the typical investor doesn't necessarily isn't driven by the neutral application of policies. And then I'm going to talk about different kinds of deals, whether deals are open or closed, whether they're available to everyone or just people with ties to the regime, and whether they're ordered or disordered. In other words, when a deal is made to do an investment in a particular area, whether the conditions surrounding that are likely to be maintained for 10 or 20 years, or whether they could be changed at any moment. Deals getting more or less ordered can produce big changes in the growth rate. Things. You can either take the test, or you can pay somebody to get you a driver's license. So some people take the test, and some people hire an agent. And if you hire an agent, it's the deal is very simple. You pay however many rupees, and then you get the license. Doesn't matter whether you're the prince of India or a poor person. It's the same cost. And then, rules capitalism, that the number of days it's supposed to take to start a business should be the number of days it takes to start a business, right? Well, the answer is, so here's the rules, number of days to start a business. And then from the World Bank's own enterprise surveys, this is the number of days it actually takes firms to start a business. And the answer is 60. Doesn't matter what the rules are in the books, it takes about 60 days to start a business anywhere in the developing world. So that's a problem, right? For improving institutions and changing the laws. It turns out that there's a lot of variance for what firms' experiences are for being able to, in this case I believe it's getting a construction permit. So the firms at the 10th percentile, the most lucky firms, it only takes them 10 days to get a construction permit. But when you get to the 90th percentile, the least lucky, it actually takes them closer to the number of days that it's supposed to take. So you know this saying, or you might not know it, but there's a saying in English, for my friends, anything. For my enemies, the law. And this is what we have here. In a deals world, you get it done if you're friendly, and if you're not friendly, you might actually have to follow the procedure. Open deals, available to anyone, like the Delhi driver's license. Closed deals, only specific individuals or organizations, usually connected with the regime. And then ordered deals stay done, like when you buy your driver's license in Delhi, you get a driver's license. Or disordered deals, where you get your construction permit today, but then tomorrow somebody from the environmental ministry comes and says, oh, you haven't, there's something wrong on the permit here. We have to revisit it. They're looking for a bribe. And then so depending on where we are in this matrix, it's going to be a different kind of environment. Closed ordered deals, an example of this familiar, just right around here, Indonesia under Suharto. Indonesia was one of the most consistent growers. They did it without great rules. They did it through a deals environment where those who were connected to Suharto did very well. If you were investing and you were well connected with the regime, there was no ambiguity about whether your investment would be honored. The years of dictatorship or conflict, you would say these were closed and disordered deals. You could only invest if you had ties to the regime, but they couldn't even honor it because either they didn't have control over the layers below them, or there was so much political risk that they didn't even necessarily have control over the territory. Think about a country transitioning from a deals world to a rules world, and we're not the first to make this broad distinction. Acemoglu and Robinson talk about inclusive economic institutions versus extractive economic institutions. Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize, has a book a few years ago called Violence and Social Order, in which they talk about natural order societies, which is almost everyone, and then open order societies, which is after they finally agreed to a law that applies to everyone. So how do you transition from a deals world to a rules world, and what does that mean for economic growth? So a move from disordered to ordered deals can usually accelerate economic growth, even without the institutions getting better. A move from ordered deals to disordered deals can usually lead to a growth collapse. Even just the expectation that deals won't be honored means that investment will pull back, and that can become self-fulfilling through the business cycle that you're familiar with. Extremely rare. And one of the hard things about this is there's a lot of people who benefit from deals. And why would you give that up, right? If you're controlling, if you're part of the regime and benefiting from it, then the interest to suddenly be on a level playing field with everybody else is not always there. It takes countries to be in a particular place and time in their history for the elites to share that interest with other segments of the population. And very often, it's not just the elite who might not want to move in this direction, but if there's a patronage system of politics where people expect some sort of personal return from their officials, they might be reluctant to leave that kind of system and be in a more open political system. Okay, so then what does this mean for coming back to institutions? And I guess so if we define state capabilities sort of like these institutional variables, but it's the ability of agents of the state, whether the bureaucrats and regulators, to actually carry out the policies that are in the books. And they might not want to do that because they can have some personal gain. They might not be responsible up the chain because it's just a weaker organization. And there might be sort of bad rules that are there in general from some previous thing that's been blocked by reform. And then here is Singapore. If you look at the time path of these institutional changes over time, it's very limited. They're pretty much flat. It's hard to change institutions in a short period of time, and that's partly why there's such a weak correlation between the change in institutions and economic performance. So if you want to think about, I laugh at donor projects that it's a 3-year project where they're going to do capacity building and improve institutions. Because you should have a time horizon instead of 3 years for more like 20 or 40 years. And when you think about, when you get frustrated sometimes with how your government is not working for you all the time, think, it happens, right? Even in, or maybe especially in the United States and Canada right now. The sort of realistic expectation to have is for fundamental processes not to change in a 1 or 2 year horizon, but to really be a generational change, and then to think of it on average, they're very slow changes. Okay, now the next section I want to talk about how the interests of the economy can have an effect on the quality and the kinds of institutions. And when we think about a frontier economy like Mongolia, we're distinguished along 2 dimensions. One is put your mindset in the foreign investor. Why would you go to Mongolia with an investment? Well, either you want to serve the domestic market, and so bring your luxury goods or non-luxury goods and sell them to Mongolians, or you want to use Mongolia as a base for export, using Mongolian natural resources or labor in order to produce something and sell to the rest of the world. Okay. And the second dimension is how are profits earned? Now in business school, in the strategy course, we talk about getting a competitive advantage and distinguishing your product from others, and then having the right corporate strategy to bring the most value to that particular organization. So that's like normal competition. And most firms in the United States are going to be operating along those rules. But in frontier economies, very often the largest businesses are operating in industries where their profits are made through some discretionary regulation by the government. through the nature of their deal with the government. So either, let's say you literally signed an investment agreement, which is a kind of a deal, and the amount of profit you make is determined in part by the quality of the natural resource and the cost of getting it to market, but also in part by the level of taxation, right? So the lower the taxes, the more money you make. It doesn't mean you can ignore your logistics and everything, but it means that there's additional source of profit. Another kind of high rent or discretionary rent firms would be operating a monopoly, either a natural monopoly or a regulated monopoly in which the government regulator, based on their decisions, can determine whether you make a lot of money or not too much money. Market and whether your profits, whether your type of business competition is normal, competitive, or trying to get discretionary rents, then we end up with 4 boxes here. So we'll start up here. The high rent, export oriented, we call rentiers, or firms that are basically in oil and gas or mining, getting their rents based on their relationships and their deal, and then selling it to the rest of the world. The higher rent domestic sector we call power brokers. Usually, if in my work in Liberia, when we'd say, "Oh, let's talk to the private sector," that's a good idea, right? We should listen to what they want to say. Guess who shows up at those meetings? It's always these guys, because they're the ones whose profit depends on their government relations. The firms that are operating on a more competitive side, like restaurant chains competing with each other, what are they gonna say at that meeting? So we can think of power generation. That's just by naturally, because you're selling into a grid. That's your profits are determined by the tariff you get paid for each kilowatt hour of power that you generate. A port, not a problem in Mongolia, right? Or natural monopolies. And then we have the workhorses, firms that are serving the domestic market in competitive industries. So again, your restaurants, your farmers, your home builders, your lawyers, your dentists. These would be workhorses. And in the more kind of developed the economy, the more business activity is going to fall into this bucket. Unless they're highly internationalized, then it can be up here. And then finally, the magicians that are operating in competitive sectors internationally. Why do I call them magicians? Because the success of one magician doesn't diminish from the success of another one. A successful rentier, those successes sometimes go at the expense of tax collection. A successful workhorse, when one restaurant does better, they might get business from another restaurant. But if you have a cashmere, designer from Mongolia, and they do well, that's only going to bring more prestige and attention towards that sector in Mongolia, and then a broader, Michael Porter would call it a cluster of competitiveness could emerge, where you have greater skills and suppliers and supply chains that all support excellence in these products. So each market necessitates a different strategy for private sector development. There's conflicting advice that people give when they tell governments how to develop their private sector. Michael Porter will say you have to develop clusters and make them excellent, and then even use government resources to make the broader ecosystem around each cluster better. Well, that's great advice for the magicians, but that's terrible advice for power brokers. Imagine a cluster around with state funding towards power providers. You just have some very rich power providers. The World Bank's Doing Business project, that's great advice for workhorses. Less regulation, less red tape, gives you a better chance of operating in the formal sector, so you don't have to dodge regulators and inspectors, because the rules are fair enough to register and to pay your taxes. But that's terrible advice for the rentiers, because they need to be inspected and they need to be paying high taxes. The advice that then in the workshop that we're doing this week around investor agreements is rentiers. You've got to stay on these guys' backs, these foreign companies, and negotiate the hardest deal possible, subject to they're willing to come to the country in the first place. That's not an attitude you want to have if you're trying to attract, Apple to make to come up with a new product, or even a manufacturing company to export to the rest of the world, because they could go anywhere. And the country needs to offer a really welcoming environment, sometimes even with tax breaks. But you wouldn't want to give the tax breaks over here. Okay, so that's from the government's perspective. Now, from the firm's perspective, strategy in each of these boxes is going to be different, and therefore their demands of government are going to be different. I've got my boxes switched. This was from an earlier draft. So magicians are going to, they're going to want special economic zones, good infrastructure, tax holidays. Rentiers are going to want good infrastructure. They're going to actually want a relatively weak regulatory capability of the government because they'd like to be left on their own. They don't need good laws more broadly because they might sign an agreement that gives them a 30-year stabilization. So they don't really care what happens to the broader legal development. Power brokers, what capabilities do they like? They like weak institutions, sometimes a lot of red tape, because then they're back. Remember that earlier graph about the 10% favored firms versus the 90th percentile unfavored firms benefit from a very confusing environment because they get what they want in 10 days anyhow. And then, the key driver of competitive advantage is barriers to entry. What barrier to entry is greater than a totally poorly designed business environment? That helps a workhorse, but it might hurt a power broker who likes to maintain a monopoly position. There's a couple sort of hypotheses, and I want to show you a bit more of I'm going to just present you with kind of a few rules, not like the rules from before, but observations that seem to characterize most situations. So if foreign exchange and the discretionary rents are appropriable and transferable. So if the government can easily get its hands on the foreign exchange, whether it's through natural resource production, foreign assistance, or remittances when people send money from working abroad back home, then it's very easy for power brokers to define the business environment. And why is that? Because the government doesn't have to worry about generating foreign exchange to prevent a budget crisis or a balance of payments crisis. It's able to get that from this external source of funds. Development. Basically, what I'm trying to develop here is a political economy of development through the lens of business and government relations. So economic development in this framework, we would see more workhorses, more magicians, producing more complex products. The product space is a concept that's coined by my former colleagues at Harvard, Ricardo Hausman and his co-authors, where they basically look at what a country makes. And they say the product space is more complex when richer countries are consuming those products. So they define a complexity basically as the average income per capita of the importer of that product. And then a few stylized facts come out of this. One is that richer countries like Denmark, they don't just specialize in one thing, they actually can make just about everything. And the richer the country is, the more likely they are to make complex products. So the way that would show up on our thing is by having, more and different kinds of magicians and workhorses making more things. So we would see economic development just going to that side. Similarly, political development can be seen as firms in the private sector that is in favor of a rules capitalism as opposed to a deals capitalism. And it's almost just a game of numbers. This idea that countries spend sometimes growing quickly, and sometimes in collapse, and sometimes in something in between. Often we'll see a boom coming when the country moves from disordered to ordered deals. So let's say there's a period of luck for the country, its terms of trade improve. it's able to suddenly get a lot of money and prosperity through existing industries, maybe from a rise in commodity prices. The question is what happens next? If that boom in prosperity empowers the power brokers and the rentiers at the expense of the workhorses and magicians, then it might be a great decade for economic growth, but the political institutions can become worse over time. They can become less representative. The clientelistic and patronage relationships can become more entrenched. And then suddenly things change, and rather than having a broader, more diversified, more complex industrial base, but we're trying to have like a more of a systemic approach to saying if this happens to the deals environment, what will happen to the responsible for partly how I see the world, but I hope to be working more in Mongolia going forward. Let me change that. The black line is the GDP per capita of Liberia. You can see here, it went from over $700 per person to less than $70 per person. Probably the biggest drop of any country in the data sets that we have since 1960. And then the red line is the growth rate that corresponds to this. And then let me show you the growth dictator of Liberia. He got the iron ore companies to come. He provided a stable environment for foreign investment. And the country grew, it says here 2.5%, but the 50s were really good for Liberia before we had the data available, in which Liberia was one of the faster growing countries in the world. And then he dies and the vice president takes over. Commodity prices have fallen. And meanwhile, this was a very closed economic system. And then as Tolbert opens it up, in the face of falling commodity prices, growth is basically flat. Then there's a coup. A young 27-year-old master sergeant of the army kills William. Peace agreements that get broken. And then finally, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who won a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for her work rebuilding the country, after she's elected, it grows very quickly, like Mongolian-style government positions, as well as running or being part of power broker companies. And the real hard work occurred often with foreigners who weren't even Liberians from the non-privileged group, but they might have been Lebanese or Indian business people who were kind of working in the more competitive. So basically they get a lot of money from the iron ore concessions as well as rubber concessions. And then if here just made the deals further closed, which didn't enable the institutions to emerge for when prices would eventually fall. So here's an example. They built, they had money in the government. They built roads that went to the interior, which would normally bring about political development or economic development. But instead what happened is those who were connected to the regime, they used their power and they took all the land beside the road. So then the low and distributing it through the economy, closed order deals. Workhorses, the vast majority of the population, but not a big share of the economy. Open and disordered deals. And then finally, a lack of magicianage system and the fact that you can have decades of strong economic growth that's sowing the seeds for its own demise. Let me just go to a policy of doing basic things to get some competence back into the institutions. She was able to improve, this is every single measure of governance, just undergoes a step change during this period. It's still very bad, but it's much better than it was before, and it moves much more developmentalist set of rules that makes the workhorses go back out into the fields, that allows them to sort of expand their production from during the war period. And even the business environment improves a little bit, which makes people more likely to undertake businesses. There's a couple brave people who have social enterprise connections that try to export things like t-shirts. And then, but sort of maybe the underbelly of this is that this has now created enough prosperity, and it's still a relatively low capability state. And so you see the rise of the rent seekers again. Fraction of time Mongolia spends in each of the growth categories, from rapid growth to collapse. And then the dotted bars are how much time every country in the rest of the world spends in those periods. So you can see, on average, Mongolia's more of a boom and bust than, if it were Denmark, it would all be here. And Mongolia's kind of got a distribution across the periods. So if you want to grow quickly, or if you want to be rich over time, just stop doing this. That's my last advice.